When I turned 68, I thought I was finally stepping into the quiet season of my life. Not the kind of quiet that feels empty, the kind that feels earned. 32 years in the same two-story house in Houston. 4 bedrooms. A creaky staircase my husband always promised to fix. An oak tree in the backyard that grew taller than my son. A kitchen island that held every Thanksgiving turkey, every birthday cake, every apology, and every celebration. That house had watched me become a wife, then a mother, then a widow. And at 68, I believed it was time to let it go, not because I had to, but because I wanted to help my son. He said the expansion would change everything. Mom, if we can just secure this investment, the company will double in 2 years. He showed me charts, growth projections, clean spreadsheets printed in black ink. My daughter-in-law stood beside him at the dining table, nodding gently, her hand resting on his shoulder like a silent endorsement. It's temporary, she added. And you won't be alone. You'll stay with us. We've already talked about turning the guest room into something more comfortable for you. Something more comfortable. I looked around that kitchen one last time that afternoon, sunlight cutting across the countertops, dust floating in golden streaks. I ran my hand along the edge of the island where my husband once carved a tiny scratch while assembling a high chair. This house will always protect you, he used to say. I told myself I was protecting my son now. The realtor listed the house on a Friday. By Monday, it had 3 offers. The market was strong. The paperwork moved quickly, too quickly, perhaps. My son's attorney handled everything. He said it would be simpler. I didn't hire my own lawyer. I trusted my child. When the closing day came, I signed my name where they told me to sign, initialed where the yellow tabs pointed, smiled at the young escrow officer who congratulated me on starting a new chapter. I deposited the funds exactly as my son advised, into a joint business account temporarily, he said, just to move things faster for the expansion loan approval. Temporary. I packed 2 suitcases, 1 box of framed photos, my husband's watch, and the ceramic pie dish my mother gave me in 1978. The movers took the rest. I remember locking the front door for the last time. I didn't cry. I pressed my palm against the wood, felt its warmth from the Texas sun, and whispered, "Thank you." My flight to Dallas was scheduled for 3:45 p.m. My son said he'd pick me up at arrivals. When I landed, my phone buzzed before I reached baggage claim. A text, not a call. "Mom, we've been thinking. It might be better if you find a small rental nearby for now, just until things settle." For now. I stood beside the carousel as suitcases circled endlessly, metal grinding against metal. Families reunited around me. Children ran into grandparents' arms. I read the message 3 times. Another text followed. "It'll give everyone more privacy. We just want what's healthiest." Healthiest. I looked down at the 2 suitcases at my feet. Everything I owned fit inside them now. 32 years reduced to airline weight limits. I didn't reply immediately. Instead, I sat down in one of those molded plastic airport chairs and folded my hands in my lap. I watched people move past me like a river flowing around a stone. No one noticed the older woman sitting alone with 2 suitcases and a phone glowing in her palm. I booked a rideshare. The driver asked if I was visiting family. "Yes," I said. Something like that. The apartment I found that night was 600 square feet. 2nd floor. Beige carpet. A window that faced the parking lot instead of trees. The air conditioner rattled every time it turned on. The leasing agent called it cozy. I signed a 12-month lease the next morning. That first night, I placed my husband's watch on the bedside table. I lined the framed photos along the wall because I didn't have the strength to hang them yet. I heated a frozen dinner in a microwave that smelled faintly of someone else's popcorn. The silence there was different. It wasn't earned. It was imposed. 2 days later, my son called. "Mom, we just need time to adjust. You understand, right?" His voice was careful, measured, as if speaking to someone fragile. I pictured the guest room they had promised me. I pictured my old bedroom furniture probably already sold with the house. "I understand," I said. And I did, just not in the way he expected. Because sitting in that small apartment, staring at the blank white wall across from my rented couch, I realized something that hadn't been clear at the airport. I hadn't sold my home to start a new chapter. I had sold my leverage. And for the first time since signing those closing documents, I began to wonder why everything had moved so quickly. Why my daughter-in-law had insisted on handling the transfer. Why the funds were placed where they were. Why the word temporary felt so permanent. I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I opened my laptop instead. And that was the moment my real chapter began. The second morning in that apartment, I woke up disoriented. For a few seconds, I reached toward the right side of the bed, expecting to feel the cool stretch of space that used to belong to my husband. Instead, my hand met a wall, 6 inches away. That's how far the bed was from the paint. I lay there listening to the air conditioner hum. It clicked on every 7 minutes like clockwork. In my old house, the system was quiet. We had replaced it 5 years before my husband passed. He said comfort was worth the money. Comfort. I sat up slowly and looked around the room. 2 suitcases against the wall. A folding chair doubling as a nightstand. My framed photos still leaning on the floor because I hadn't bought nails yet. This wasn't a transition. This was a downgrade. By noon, I forced myself to unpack the kitchen box. 1 plate, 1 mug, 2 forks. I placed them neatly inside cabinets that smelled faintly of cleaning chemicals. I used to own a full set of china. 12 settings. Wedding gift from 1981. Now I own what fit inside a cardboard box labeled Essentials. Around 3 in the afternoon, I opened my banking app. Not out of panic. Out of habit. The funds from the house sale had already been transferred fully into my son's business account. I still had viewing access. He told me it was for transparency. The balance was lower than it had been at closing. Several outgoing transactions, equipment deposits, marketing retainers, and 1 large consulting payment, $48,000. The consulting firm name caught my attention. It wasn't unfamiliar. It carried my daughter-in-law's maiden name. I didn't assume. Assumptions make you emotional. I prefer numbers. I clicked through the transaction. Details. The payment had cleared the same day I signed my lease. The same day I sat alone in that airport chair. I placed my phone down carefully on the small kitchen table. 32 years of mortgage payments. Yard work. Property taxes. Home insurance. Converted into digital transfers within days. That evening my son called. "Mom, are you settling in okay?" His voice sounded relaxed. Almost cheerful. "Yes," I said. "It's quiet." "That's good. You need peace." Peace. I glanced at the thin walls. At the parking lot outside my window. Did the expansion move forward? I asked casually. "Yeah. We've already started allocating funds. It's moving fast." Moving fast. That phrase again. After we hung up, I opened my laptop. Not to scroll. To read. I searched the consulting firm listed in the transaction history. The website was new. Recently registered. Minimal information. The registered agent's last name matched hers exactly. I didn't feel anger. Not yet. What I felt was clarity. The guest room they promised me likely never existed. The temporary arrangement had structure behind it. And structure requires planning. I folded my hands on the table and looked around the apartment one more time. I had given them the house, but I hadn't given them my mind. And at 68, I finally understood something important. Kindness without boundaries is just permission. That night, I began gathering documents. Quietly, carefully, without saying a word. By Monday morning, I had a folder. Not a dramatic one. Just a plain manila folder from the office supply store down the street. Inside it, the closing statement from my house sale. The transfer confirmation to my son's business account. Screenshots of the consulting payment. A printed copy of the consulting firm's registration details. Paper has weight. It feels different than numbers on a screen. I sat at the small kitchen table, the one that wobbled slightly if I leaned too hard, and spread everything out again. Dates, amounts, names. Everything had moved within 10 business days. My house closed on a Thursday. Funds transferred Friday morning. Consulting payment issued Monday afternoon. Efficient. Too efficient. I made coffee in a single-serve machine I had bought at Target. The sound of it brewing was sharp in the quiet apartment. While it dripped, I replayed conversations in my mind. "Mom, we just need liquidity. It's only temporary. You'll be more comfortable near us." Comfortable. I hadn't even seen the guest room they promised me before the sale. I trusted the description. That afternoon, I drove past their house again. This time, I parked across the street. No confrontation. No announcement. Just observation. Through the front window, I could see my old dining table. They had kept that. The one my husband refinished himself. It sat beneath a new chandelier. White curtains framed the windows. Crisp, expensive. I noticed something else. A delivery truck parked in the driveway. The side read, "Elite Fitness Installations." 2 men carried equipment inside. I didn't need to guess where it was going. The guest room window was slightly open. From where I sat, I could see metal bars being assembled. Weights. A bench. The space that was supposed to hold my suitcase and my winter coats. I rested my hands on the steering wheel and breathed slowly. Anger would have been easier. But anger makes noise. Noise warns people. Instead, I watched. 20 minutes later, my daughter-in-law stepped outside to supervise. She looked pleased, confident, secure. She glanced down the street once. Our eyes didn't meet. I drove away before they could. That evening, my son called again. "Mom, everything okay? You've been quiet." "I've just been organizing," I said. "Organizing what?" "Loose ends." There was a pause. Not long. Just enough. I changed the subject. After we hung up, I opened my laptop and searched for a name I hadn't thought about in years. Thomas Grady. My husband's old CPA. He handled our taxes for nearly 2 decades. Precise. Methodical. The kind of man who read every line before signing anything. I found his number online. He hadn't retired. That surprised me. I didn't call immediately. Instead, I looked around the apartment again. 600 square feet. Thin walls. Neutral carpet. Temporary. Maybe. But something inside me no longer felt temporary. At 68, I wasn't confused. I was recalculating. And this time, I wasn't signing anything without reading every word twice. I waited until Tuesday morning to call Thomas Grady. Not late in the day. Not impulsively. At 9:15 a.m., after I had reviewed every document in that manila folder one more time, I dialed his office. He answered on the third ring. Grady and Associates. His voice sounded older, but steady. "This is Margaret Ellis," I said. "Daniel Ellis's wife." There was a pause. Then recognition. "Margaret, I'm so sorry about Daniel." "So am I," I replied. "I need to ask you something." I didn't explain everything over the phone. I simply asked if he could review a transaction involving the sale of my primary residence and a capital transfer into a privately held company. He didn't rush me. "Bring everything you have," he said, "and don't sign anything else." I almost smiled. I hadn't planned to. His office was 40 minutes from my apartment. The drive gave me time to think, not about betrayal, but about sequence. When did the tone shift? When did Mom become liability? When did I become a line item? Thomas sat across from me in a room lined with old tax binders. I placed the folder on his desk and slid the papers toward him. He read without speaking. That's something I've always respected. People who let silence do its job. He stopped at the consulting payment. "Do you know this firm?" he asked. I recognized the last name. He nodded slowly. "And you transferred the entire net proceeds of the home sale?" "Yes." "Was there a formal loan agreement drafted?" "No equity stake?" "No collateral?" I shook my head. He leaned back in his chair. "Margaret," he said carefully, "you didn't invest. You gifted." The word landed harder than I expected. Gifted. I felt my spine straighten. "There was an understanding," I said, "that I would live with them." He didn't challenge that. But he didn't validate it either. "Was that written anywhere?" "No, it wasn't." He folded his hands. "The consulting fee concerns me more than the gift," he continued. "Especially if there's a related party relationship that wasn't disclosed properly." Related party relationship. Polite words for something closer to self-dealing. He turned his monitor toward me and pulled up public records. The consulting firm had been registered 3 weeks before my house went on the market. 3 weeks. My home hadn't even been listed yet. I felt the air shift in my lungs. Not anger. Not grief. Clarity. They were preparing infrastructure, Thomas said evenly. Before liquidity. Liquidity. Another clean word. He printed additional documents and placed them into my folder. "You have options," he said. "But the key is timing. If external investors come in, this becomes more complicated." Investors. The dinner. The catered trays. The gym equipment. All of it connected now. I closed the folder slowly. "Do I still have leverage?" I asked. He met my eyes directly. "Yes," he said. "If you move before they expect you to." On the drive back to my apartment, I didn't turn on the radio. I didn't cry. I thought about something my husband once told me while refinancing our mortgage decades ago. Never sign away power just because you love someone. At 68, I realized I hadn't signed away power. I had temporarily misplaced it. And now, I knew exactly where to look. After my meeting with Thomas, I didn't rush. Rushing is what got me here. Instead, I waited 48 hours. Long enough for the investor dinner to happen. long enough for the company to continue operating as if nothing had shifted. On Thursday morning, I returned to the bank, this time with a formal letter drafted by Thomas outlining potential non-disclosure of related party compensation tied to transferred residential proceeds. Again, no dramatic language, just structure. The account officer reviewed the letter carefully. If external investors are entering based on incomplete disclosure, she said, the bank has an obligation to review exposure. Exposure. Another clean word. By Friday afternoon, a portion of the funds in the business account were placed under temporary review. Not seized. Not accused. Reviewed. That evening, my phone rang. Mom, my son said, voice tight. Did you initiate a compliance review? Yes. You froze working capital. I asked for clarification. There was a long pause on the other end. We have investor follow-ups next week. Then transparency will help you. I replied calmly. Silence again. Then, you don't trust us? I stood by the small apartment window, watching a car pull into the parking lot below. I trusted you with my house, I said. Now I'm trusting documentation. His breathing changed. This could damage our credibility. So could undisclosed consulting payments. That's when he stopped defending. He started calculating. Can we meet? He asked. Bring your wife, I said, and your financial records. Sunday afternoon, they came to my apartment. They had never visited before. My daughter-in-law stepped inside slowly, her eyes scanning the narrow living room, the folding dining table, the thin walls. This is small, she said carefully. It fits what I was offered, I replied. We sat down. No raised voices. No accusations. Just paper. Thomas joined by speakerphone. He explained the difference between a gift, a loan, and an equity investment. He explained disclosure requirements when family-owned vendors receive large payments from investor-backed funds. My son didn't interrupt. My daughter-in-law crossed her arms once, then uncrossed them. Finally, my son looked at me. We were going to formalize everything later. Later doesn't protect me, I said quietly. There it was. Not anger. Not revenge. Protection. I slid a printed draft agreement across the table. Terms Thomas had prepared. Structured repayment schedule. Equity percentage proportional to transfer. Full disclosure of related party contracts. No theatrics. Just clarity. My daughter-in-law exhaled slowly. You blindsided us, she said. I met her eyes. I felt the same way at the airport. The room went still. Not hostile. Just honest. By the time they left, nothing had been signed yet. But something had changed. They no longer spoke to me like a dependent parent. They spoke to me like a stakeholder. That night, sitting alone in my 600-square-foot apartment, I realized something important. They didn't panic because I was hurt. They panicked because I understood the numbers. And at 68, understanding the numbers is more powerful than raising your voice. I had sold my house, but I hadn't sold my awareness. And that, finally, shifted the balance. The bank review didn't last forever. It wasn't meant to. It was pressure, not punishment. By Wednesday, Thomas called with an update. They've responded, he said. They're willing to formalize the transfer as structured equity with partial repayment terms. Willing. Interesting word. 3 weeks ago, I was at temporary inconvenience. Now I was a line item requiring negotiation. That afternoon, my son came alone. No wife this time. He stood outside my apartment door for a moment before knocking. I could see his shadow through the frosted glass. When I opened it, he didn't step inside immediately. I didn't think it would go this far, he said. Neither did I replied. We sat at the small table again. 600 square feet. 2 coffee mugs. No raised voices. He placed a revised agreement in front of me. 30% equity stake in the expansion division. A documented repayment schedule over 5 years. Full disclosure of all related party vendor contracts moving forward. This protects everyone, he said. No, it protects structure, which is what I had asked for from the beginning. I'm not trying to control your company, I told him. I'm protecting what your father and I built. He looked down at his hands. I thought you'd just trust us. I did. That's why we were here. Silence filled the room, but it wasn't hostile anymore. It felt mature. After a moment, he glanced around the apartment. You don't have to stay here, he said quietly. There it was. The offer. Late. Unsteady. I didn't answer immediately. I'm fine here, I said. For now. This time, I chose the word. For now. He nodded slowly, understanding the difference. Before he left, He hesitated at the door. Mom, we weren't trying to push you out. I held his gaze. You already did, I said calmly. But we can decide what happens next. That's the thing about power. It doesn't have to shout. It just has to stand. After he left, I reviewed the agreement carefully. Every clause, every definition. Thomas confirmed the language protected my position and required transparent reporting before any outside investment closed. By Friday, the temporary bank hold was lifted under documented restructuring terms. The company would move forward. But so would I. That evening, I walked around the small complex where my apartment sat. The sunset reflected off parked cars instead of oak trees. The air smelled faintly of asphalt instead of cut grass. It wasn't the life I imagined at 68. But it was honest. I had given my son opportunity. Now I had reclaimed stability. And for the first time since locking the front door of my old house, I didn't feel displaced. I felt anchored. Not to a property, not to a promise, but to myself. The paperwork was signed the following Monday. Not in my apartment. Not at their house. At Thomas's office. Neutral ground. My son arrived 10 minutes early. My daughter-in-law came 5 minutes after him. Neither of them spoke much while we waited in the reception area. There's something about legal offices that levels people. The quiet. The framed certifications. The steady ticking of a wall clock that doesn't care about anyone's ego. Thomas walked us through each clause again. Equity allocation. Reporting obligations. Restrictions on related party vendor payments without disclosure. Repayment triggers if external investors entered under revised valuation. No shortcuts. No verbal understandings. Ink only. When it was my turn to sign, I didn't hesitate, but I didn't rush either. I read the final page twice. At 68, I no longer signed from emotion. I signed from clarity. Afterward, my son thanked Thomas. My daughter-in-law gave a tight smile and said, "We appreciate getting this resolved." Resolved. Interesting word. Outside the office, my son paused beside my car. "We're restructuring some internal roles," he said carefully. "For optics." Optics. Meaning investors had asked questions. Meaning the bank review had done its job. Good, I said. Transparency scales better than secrecy. He gave a small nod. Not defensive this time. Not dismissive. Just aware. That evening, I returned to my apartment and did something I hadn't done since moving in. I hung the photos on the wall. One by one. My wedding day. My son at 8 years old holding a fishing rod twice his height. The house, freshly painted in 1992, with the oak tree still thin and young. I stepped back and looked at them. For weeks, those frames had been leaning against the wall like unfinished thoughts. Now they were anchored. Like me. On Wednesday, my son called again. "We've adjusted the consulting agreement," he said. "Different fee structure. Full disclosure in the investor packet." "Good," I replied. He hesitated. "You really would have let it fall apart, wouldn't you?" I considered that. "No," I said. "I would have let it be honest. There's a difference." That night, I reviewed the updated investor summary Thomas forwarded to me. My name appeared under equity stakeholders. Documented. Defined. Not as a gift. Not as an afterthought. As a participant. And something shifted inside me. Not pride. Not victory. Balance. I had lost a house. But I hadn't lost position. And in many ways, position is what keeps a woman safe when the walls change. 600 square feet still surrounded me. Thin walls. Neutral carpet. But it no longer felt like exile. It felt like transition, chosen, not imposed. At 68, I finally understood something my husband used to say during difficult negotiations. Never confuse kindness with surrender. I had been kind, but I had not surrendered. And now, neither had my future. 2 weeks passed without drama. No urgent calls. No tense meetings. No unexpected bank alerts. On paper, everything looked stable. The revised agreement had been filed. The investor packet reflected proper disclosures. The consulting contract had been adjusted to market rate and clearly documented. Structure brings calm, but calm doesn't erase memory. One Saturday morning, my son invited me to the office. "We're doing a walkthrough before final investor confirmation," he said. "I'd like you there." Not because he had to, because it mattered. The office space was larger than I remembered. Fresh paint, new glass conference room, polished floors that reflected overhead lights. Growth. Real growth this time, not just projections on paper. When I stepped inside, a few staff members greeted me politely. One even said, "It's great to finally meet you." Finally, I noticed something subtle. On the wall near the entrance hung a framed display listing company leadership and stakeholders. My name was there. Margaret Ellis, equity partner. Not advisor. Not support. Defined. My daughter-in-law stood near the conference table reviewing documents. She looked up when I entered. Her smile wasn't warm, but it wasn't dismissive either. It was careful. Careful as honest. During the walkthrough, investors asked structured questions. Revenue models. Vendor transparency. Governance. This time, my son answered clearly. When one investor asked about internal consulting expenditures, my daughter-in-law explained the revised structure without hesitation. No deflection. No vague language. Documentation changes behavior. After the meeting, as people filtered out, my son approached me. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For what?" "For not walking away." I looked around the office again. Glass walls. Brighter lighting. Movement. "I didn't stay for you," I said gently. "I stayed for what your father built." He nodded. He understood. That evening, back in my apartment, I sat on the couch and thought about the difference between control and respect. Control demands. Respect requires boundaries. I hadn't forced myself back into their home. I hadn't insisted on moving in. Instead, I had secured position where it mattered. In structure, in documentation, in ownership. The apartment still measured 600 square feet. But it felt less temporary now. Not because I planned to stay forever, but because I was choosing my next move, not reacting to theirs. At 68, I realized something else. Family doesn't guarantee fairness. But clarity can. And clarity, once established, changes the way people treat you, even when they thought they never would. I turned off the lights that night without resentment. Not because everything was repaired, but because everything was defined. And defined things are harder to take away. The investors finalized their commitment the following week. It wasn't a dramatic announcement. No champagne. No ribbon cutting. Just a signed term sheet and a scheduled capital infusion. This time, every signature had context. Every number had disclosure. Every vendor relationship had a footnote. Structure had replaced assumption. On Tuesday afternoon, my son stopped by my apartment again. Unannounced, but not unwelcome. He looked tired. Not stressed. Just older. "We closed," he said. "I know," I replied. Thomas had already forwarded the confirmation documents. He stepped inside and glanced around, as if seeing the space differently now. The framed photos were still on the wall. The small kitchen table still held neatly stacked papers. "You don't have to stay here anymore," he said again. The offer sounded steadier this time. Less guilt. More invitation. I poured coffee into 2 mismatched mugs. "I'm not in a hurry," I said. He nodded, then sat down. "There was a moment," he admitted, "when I thought you were trying to take control. I considered that. Control feels threatening when you're used to not being questioned," I said calmly. He didn't argue. Outside, a car door slammed in the parking lot below. The ordinary sound grounded the room. "I underestimated you," he said finally. That didn't offend me. It clarified things. "I underestimated myself too," I replied. And that was the truth. For years, I had defined my value inside the family by what I provided. Meals, space, money, stability. But value without boundaries turns invisible. We talked for nearly an hour. Not about contracts. Not about equity. About responsibility. About legacy. About what it means to build something without compromising integrity. Before he left, he stood by the door and hesitated. "Dad would have handled this differently," he said. I shook my head gently. No, he would have handled it exactly this way. Just earlier. That night, I reviewed the updated shareholder report one more time. My equity percentage was locked. Repayment term scheduled. Governance revisions documented. Nothing emotional. Everything clear. I sat back on the couch and looked around my 600 square foot apartment. It hadn't changed. But I had. I no longer felt displaced. I felt deliberate. The house I sold had walls. But what I reclaimed had foundation. And foundations don't depend on square footage. They depend on standing your ground. Even when it's uncomfortable. Especially then. A month after the investors closed, I received my first formal shareholder report. Not a casual email. A structured document. Quarterly projections. Revenue summaries. Expense breakdowns. Governance updates. My name sat in the header under Equity Partners. Defined. Accounted for. Not implied. I reviewed the numbers slowly at my kitchen table, The same table that once held nothing but doubt and printed bank statements. Once earned, doesn't disappear easily. By early spring, the company had stabilized. Revenue reports were consistent. Investor updates were predictable. My equity statements arrived on schedule without needing reminders. Predictability is underrated, especially after chaos. One afternoon, I received a formal invitation, not a casual text, to attend the company's quarterly strategy presentation. It was being held at a downtown hotel conference room. My name was printed on the invitation. Margaret Ellis, equity partner, defined again. I chose a navy suit I hadn't worn since my husband's retirement dinner. Structured, clean lines, quiet confidence. When I arrived, several investors shook my hand. "It's good to meet the original capital partner," one of them said. Original. The word stayed with me. During the presentation, my son spoke clearly. My daughter-in-law handled marketing projections with precision. Slides displayed growth metrics, compliance updates, governance transparency. Everything we had fought over, now part of the formal narrative. At one point, my son paused and gestured toward me. "I'd like to acknowledge my mother," he said. Her early support and insistence on structure helped position us for this stage. The room turned slightly. I didn't stand. I didn't wave. I simply nodded. Recognition doesn't need volume. After the event, my daughter-in-law approached me near the refreshment table. "You were right," she said quietly. "About what?" "About documentation. About boundaries." Her tone wasn't defensive. It was measured. "I wasn't trying to challenge you," I replied. "I was protecting myself." "And us," she added. "Maybe. Or maybe structure protects everyone equally, whether they admit it or not." Later that evening, my son walked me to the elevator. "You could join the board formally," he said. "It would strengthen perception." Perception. Another interesting word. I considered it carefully. Perception already adjusted. I said, "What matters now is behavior." He smiled slightly. He understood. Driving home, I realized something had shifted beyond contracts and equity percentages. They no longer treated me as a dependent parent. They treated me as a stakeholder. Not because I demanded it, but because I defined it. When I returned to my apartment, I placed the printed event program on my kitchen table. 600 square feet. Still quiet. Still modest. But no longer transitional. It wasn't where I had landed by accident. It was where I had chosen to stand. At 68, I didn't regain my old house. I didn't need to. What I rebuilt was influence. Documented. Recognized. Respected. And that, I've learned, is far more durable than square footage. It has been 6 months since I locked the front door of the house on Maple Creek Drive. 6 months since I stood in an airport with 2 suitcases and a message that changed the shape of my family. I don't drive past that street anymore. Not because it hurts. Because it's no longer necessary. Last week, I signed papers for something new. Not a 4-bedroom house. Not a sprawling backyard with an oak tree. A modest townhouse 15 minutes from my apartment complex. 2 bedrooms. A small patio. Just under 1,100 square feet. Enough. When I walked through it for the first time, I didn't imagine hosting Thanksgiving for 12. I imagined quiet mornings with coffee on the patio. A bookshelf against the wall. My husband's watch resting on a solid wood nightstand again, not a folding chair. I paid for it without asking anyone's opinion. That mattered. The company continues to grow. My quarterly distributions arrive on schedule. Board summaries include my name automatically now, not as a courtesy, but as a matter of record. Last Sunday, my son and his wife came over for dinner at my apartment. Soon, it will be my townhouse. They brought flowers. We talked about business, yes, but also about ordinary things. Grocery prices, travel plans, the kind of conversations that feel balanced. At one point, my daughter-in-law looked around the small living room and said quietly, "I didn't realize how much you gave up." I set down my fork. "I didn't give it up," I said. "I converted it." She tilted her head slightly. "Into what?" "Clarity." No one argued. Later, as I washed the dishes, my son stood beside me. "I thought helping us meant you'd always be there," he admitted. "I am here," I said. "Just not without boundaries." That's the difference. At 68, I didn't lose my home. I lost an illusion. The illusion that love replaces contracts. The illusion that silence preserves peace. The illusion that generosity doesn't need structure. What I gained was quieter. Ownership. Documentation. Respect that didn't rely on proximity. The townhouse closes next month. I've already chosen where the photos will hang. This time, I won't lean them against the wall waiting for permission. I'll anchor them immediately. Because homes aren't built from square footage. They're built from decisions. And the most important decision I made at 68 wasn't selling my house. It was refusing to sell my position in my own life. I helped my son build his company. But in the process, I rebuilt something else. Myself. And that, finally, is a foundation no one can transfer without my signature.